The USA is a fairly young country, and Americans are one of the youngest nations in the world. However, American history is interesting and rich. All English language learners will benefit from understanding this, especially if you plan to work, live, or study in the United States.
The first people appeared on the territory of the modern United States about 13,000 years ago, when the Bering Strait between Alaska and Asia was either frozen or shallow. These people formed divided and warring tribes and became the ancestors of the American Indians. America was first discovered by the Icelandic Viking Leif Erikson back in 1000 AD. He even tried to colonize new lands, but the colonies did not take root. Eriksson's discovery did not have a significant impact on the history of the local population. In 1492, Christopher Columbus rediscovered America to Europeans. This fact has already turned the fate of the continent, Europe, and the whole world around. Colonization of America began in 1565 with the Spanish colonies in Florida. Then the British, French, and other Europeans began to arrive on the new continent.
In 1607, the first successful English colony, Jamestown, arose in America, in the province of Virginia. She was sponsored by the London Virginia Company, which was founded there. Before her, the British twice tried to colonize the coast of North America, but without success the colonies did not survive due to Indian raids. The settlement of Jamestown developed rapidly thanks to tobacco plantations. By 1620, about 1,000 people lived there. But the colonists' relations with the local Indians deteriorated greatly due to the seizure of land for plantations. In 1622, the Powhatan tribe carried out a massacre in the city, in which about a third of the entire population of Jamestown died. The colony managed to recover from the attack, making several retaliatory attacks.
An even more successful, and most importantly, significant colony for us history was Plymouth, also known as the Old Colony. It was founded by the famous Pilgrim Fathers who arrived on the American coast on the Mayflower. This event is considered one of the most significant in the history of the country, since it was from Plymouth that the purposeful colonization of the continent by the British began. The Pilgrim Fathers laid the foundations of American democracy, civil liberties, and traditions, and their blood flows today in tens of millions of modern Americans. The Pilgrims were English Puritans who were unhappy with the Church of England's leaning towards Catholicism. They wanted to create a democratic colony with its own church near Jamestown. After a difficult 2-month voyage, the ship sailed to the shores of America, but much north of the intended point due to an error in plotting the course. The settlers discussed the situation and decided to create the Mayflower Compact, in which they expressed their intention to found a colony independent of Virginia. The first years were difficult for the Pilgrims. Half of the settlers died in the first winter. One of the local Indians helped the colonists. He taught them how to grow pumpkin and maize and how to catch local fish and game. Largely thanks to him, the colony survived and began to develop. The following year, Governor Bradford declared a Thanksgiving Day on which the settlers celebrated their success and gave thanks to God and the Indians. This tradition spread to other colonies and later became a national holiday in the United States. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British founded 13 British colonies in North America: Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Georgia, and others. They were all quite scattered, different in national composition, religion, and culture. English Catholics settled in some, while Lutheran Germans or French Huguenots came to others. Great Britain tried to completely control the economy of the American colonies and supplied manufactured goods in exchange for local resources, being completely uninterested in the development of industry in America. Nevertheless, the colonies successfully developed in the industrial field and found new markets for manufactured goods. Great Britain tried to prohibit the colonies from building workshops and engaging in foreign trade. American society began to show dissatisfaction with colonial policies and felt the need for independence.
Back in 1754, Benjamin Franklin created a project for the union of the English colonies in America with their own government. He suggested that Great Britain appoint its own president so that the mother country retains its power. But London did not like this initiative. In 1773, Americans held a protest in Boston against the Tea Law, which the British Parliament had recently passed. This law violated the rights of the colonists, as it increased duties on British tea. In response, the Americans destroyed the British cargo of tea. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party and served as the impetus for the Revolutionary War.
In 1774, the First Continental Congress of the English Colonies met in Philadelphia. Among others, George Washington took part in it. The delegates formulated demands in Great Britain, but London reacted sharply negatively and demanded complete submission. The Americans realized that it was time to fight for independence using the main strength, unity. In 1776, the English colonies created the Continental Army and appointed Washington as general. Thus began the War of Independence, which in American literature is more often called the American Revolution. Congress convened for the second time, adopted the Declaration of Independence, which formed the basis of the Constitution of the future United States. The British king sent troops to America to suppress the uprising. The British managed to occupy New York and Philadelphia. At first, the Americans had a hard time. They lost battles and retreated. The colonists achieved their first victory at the Battle of Saratoga. Then the Americans enlisted the support of France and Spain, which gave them an advantage. The British captured Georgia and Charleston, but could not advance inland, maintaining control only over the port cities. The Americans launched a successful guerrilla war, thanks to which they defeated the British and Loyalists who wanted to maintain dependence on the mother country. In 1781, the British fleet became trapped in the Chesapeake Bay and surrendered to Washington. By that time, Britain had already stopped supporting the war. In 1782, the British House of Commons voted to end the war. Great Britain began negotiations with the colonies, which resulted in peace and recognition of the independence of the United States of America. The United States renounced its claims to Canada and the West Bank of the Mississippi. After the Revolutionary War, the United States borders included the Great Lakes in the north, the Mississippi River in the west, and Spanish Florida in the south. The Northwest Territories were ceded to the United States in 1795 after a peace treaty with the Indians was signed. America began an active period of expansion of its lands. The new country explained its expansionism with the catchphrase "Manifest Destiny." Manifest destiny, the idea of God's chosenness, was the American justification for its ambitions to expand the U.S. territory to the Pacific Ocean. It was difficult for the Indians to resist the Americans since Great Britain stopped supporting the local population. In 1803, the Americans made a successful deal, which they called the Louisiana Purchase. They acquired from France a huge territory that now includes the states of Arkansas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Kansas, and others. The banks of the Mississippi River were completely at the disposal of the United States. Americans left the settled eastern lands, crossed the Mississippi, and looked for new regions to live. They explored the Great Plains, the forests of Oregon, the steppes of Texas, and the rich lands of California. Entire caravans of ox-drawn wagons traveled across the continent. The California Gold Rush increased the influx of settlers. In 1845, Mexican Texas was ceded to the United States. In 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico, defeated the Mexican army, and occupied the country's capital. The Mexicans had to cede almost half of the territory of their state, part of the states of Arizona and New Mexico. The Civil War began in 1861. 24 Northern non-slave states united to form the Union, and 11 slave-holding Southern states formed the Confederacy. The Union was initially in more favorable conditions. 23 million people lived on its territory. Almost all of the country's industry and most of the bank deposits were located. The pretext for the war was the Battle of Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Confederates attacked the fort, opened fire, and captured it. This allowed Lincoln to call for an army gathering. The South also began calling for volunteers. The main fighting took place in the state of Virginia. At first, the Confederacy was in the lead. It had excellent commanders on its side. The Southerners won the Battle of Bull Run and then captured Washington. July 1863 marked a turning point in the war. The Confederate Army lost the Battle of Gettysburg. From this point on, things went better for the Union. The Northern Army was able to cut off Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from other parts of the Confederacy. The Confederacy lost its capital in 1865 and capitulated a few days later.
Several 100,000 people were killed on each side. The South was completely devastated and destroyed. After the war, slavery was abolished in the United States. A corresponding amendment to the Constitution appeared in 1865. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States began to actively develop. This period is called the Gilded Age. Many economists and historians believe that it was during this time that the modern American economy was founded. Industry and agriculture grew at a tremendous pace. Large corporations appeared, the population grew rapidly, and immigrants came from other countries. At the end of the 19th century, the U.S. per capita income exceeded that of Britain, Germany, and France. Large industrial cities with huge factories emerged in the northeast of the country. Labor unions emerged, including the American Federation of Labor. It was at this time that the dynasties of multimillionaires arose: the Rockefellers, the Astors, the Carnegies. The Gilded Age in the United States ended in 1893, when the country was hit by an economic crisis. 1896 saw one of the most dramatic American presidential elections. Republican McKinley defeated Democrat William Jennings Bryan by 4.3% of the vote. Thus began a new period in US history, which is called the era of progressivism. The progressive era lasted until 1920. At this time, the middle class and social lower classes of the United States were distinguished by high political activity, which led to several major reforms. For example, the introduction of an income tax, giving women the right to vote, the emergence of juvenile courts, and the modernization of the education system. During this period, the economy continued to develop actively. Conveyor production appeared, which stimulated the expansion of the middle class. Trade unions have become an influential force in politics. The Hawaiian Islands and other lands were annexed to the United States after the war with Spain. In 1917, the American Congress decided to enter World War I and declare war on Germany. American troops replenished the armies of the Entente and helped defeat Germany, which by that time was running out of strength. The United States considered the Treaty of Versailles unfair and concluded a separate treaty with Germany.
In 1920, the United States adopted prohibition, a ban on the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol. It operated for 13 years and helped reduce the level of alcohol consumption in the country by almost half. But the law also had negative sides. Many criminal organizations emerged that engaged in bootlegging. Corruption began to flourish among politicians and police officers. In 1933, prohibition was repealed. The period from 1922 to 1929 is called the era of prosperity in the United States. Prosperity. The economy continued to develop, wages rose, and the United States took a leading position in the world. Big business continued to develop. During this period, a consumer society emerged in the United States. The symbol of America these years is Henry Ford with his Ford Company and the Ford Model T, which became the first mass-produced car in the world. The automotive industry developed at a particularly high pace during this period. In 1929, the Great Depression began in America, a deep economic crisis that affected many countries. Due to the strong decline in commodity prices, production became unprofitable and began to decline. Unemployment has increased. Drought in the Great Plains led to crop failures and an environmental disaster that became known as the Dust Bowl. For several years, the U.S. prairies were regularly covered by severe dust storms. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt came to power with a new policy called the New Deal. Many of the president's decisions were controversial, but overall, he was able to stabilize the economy. He began the fight against unemployment, restored industry, adopted a number of laws on labor and pensions, stimulated housing construction, and supported culture. Roosevelt was so popular among the people that he was elected 4 times in a row. The USA participated in World War II and provided assistance to Great Britain, China, and the USSR. In 1945, Japan refused to surrender, and American bombers dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, causing enormous destruction. This is the only example in history of the combat use of nuclear weapons. From the end of World War II until 1995, the United States was in a state of Cold War with the USSR. Both states fought for global influence and carried out an arms race, periodically entering into dangerous conflicts. In recent U.S. history, one of the most significant events remains the terrorist attack of September 11, 2001, the largest in human history. Terrorists hijacked passenger planes and flew them into the World Trade Center towers in New York, killing nearly 3,000 people. Joe Biden, a representative of the Democratic Party, currently holds the position of President of the United States.